But let's get to the book of the week from last week that I'll talk about today. It is My Time Will Come by Manuel. My Time Will Come, a memoir of crime, punishment, hope, and redemption. And this was a really heavy book where Manuel shares his experience of being in prison for most of his life, starting really the age of 13. I think when he was finally sentenced, he was 14, up until he was, I think, almost 40 years old. And it is a heartbreaking tale of seeing a child born into so much poverty and trauma and hardships, and he does enter into a life of crime while he's still a child. And at the age of 13, in part of a attempted robbery or mugging on the street with a few other boys, he ends up shooting Debbie Bakery, who was at that time a young mother of two, in the face. Debbie did survive, but had to go through I think it was 40 plus operations on her face. Of course, there's going to be the psychological trauma of going through something like that, but thankfully she did survive, and I'll mention her in the story again. But because later, because she does play a part in the story throughout Manuel's life. Now, of course, what he did was horrific, robbing and shooting someone. Again, thankfully she survived, but his punishment to me is not justifiable. But he was given life in prison. So essentially he at 13, or by the time he was sentenced was 14, was basically doomed to live his whole life in jail, to never be released from jail starting at age 14. And the United States is actually the only country that does sentence 13, 14-year-old offenders to life in prison without parole, which itself is both a type of scientific, sociological, psychological issue to consider, but one that Manuel found himself in. And so he shares the heartbreaking story of what he goes through going to jail, and the majority of the book are about his experiences in prison, and then also his legal battles and struggles of somehow trying to achieve some type of freedom. Is there a way out? Is there a way that he can at least shorten his sentence in some way? And the conditions, of course, are horrible, but on top of just being in prison, he was in solitary confinement for what equivalent to about 18 years consecutively, from the age of about 15 or 14, 15 to 33 or so. As he puts it, from George H.W. Bush was president when he went in to solitary confinement, and Obama was elected and president when he finally came out. It's unbelievable. And solitary confinement is another aspect of law and punishment and the prison system that definitely has gotten lots of scrutiny. I absolutely think it is cruel and unusual punishment, and it is essentially a type of psychological torture to put someone deprived of all human contact sometimes 23, 22 hours a day, repeatedly for weeks, months, and then even years on end. It's just horrendous to do that. And he went through that starting when he was essentially still a kid. And part of the reason why was because he was too young to be in the adult general population, which maybe should make us pause and think, well, then should he be there? And to begin with, should he be tried as an adult if we can't allow him to be part of the prison population? But so was his unfortunate reality. It's interesting sometimes, when I'm reading the books, of course, I'm going through it and I'm going through my own life. I was going through a positive stress this week of moving, and there were stresses I was going through that were on my mind, and it was definitely affecting me. But it was an interesting juxtaposition, and obviously gives you some perspective. It's almost embarrassing to say I'm stressed about something like that, when then I was reading about the things he was going through. And even interestingly, so coincidentally, one night, probably because of stress of just everything that was going on. I had this dream that woke me up that I forgot the exact details, but the last part was a cockroach went over my foot and it woke me up, like kind of getting startled, or just, the discomfort of that woke me up. And then that day when I was reading the book, he shared this story in Manuel. I got to the part where he was in a solitary confinement cell, and then he started feeling cockroaches all over his body, which is just horrific. And so there I just had this bad dream that I woke up from, but he was in a living nightmare that he was sharing his experience. So again, a perspective of how lucky and grateful I can be for what I get to go through, and how unfortunate other people's circumstances can be. And so reading his story was very heartbreaking, but also inspiring when you see some aspects of it. So one very important part of Ian Manuel and who he is, because of course when you hear a story of someone who's been in jail most of his life, that becomes sometimes the most prominent thing about them, but obviously he's much more than that, which is another reason why it's good to hear and read people's stories, to humanize them, where we so often dehumanize certain individuals. But he is many things, including a poet, and a very talented one. And at the end of today's segment, I'll share a video from YouTube of him reciting one of his powerful poems, which actually it's called My Time Gonna Come, which is where the title of the book, My Time Will Come, comes from, or gets its name. But he's a very talented poet, and throughout the book he shares some of his poems, and he says that was something that helped get him through all those years of solitary confinement. I've actually wondered about that myself. If just more of a thought experiment, what would I do if you were ever in solitary confinement? And because it is just a recipe to make you go, basically insane, lose your sanity, lose touch with reality when we're deprived in all of those ways. Even when you're just deprived visually, you can start to experience hallucinations. It's called Charles Bonnet's syndrome. Even people who become blind or start to experience blindness, they start to have sometimes visual hallucinations because of this. But it's just when we're deprived in these ways, it impacts us negatively. And one of the things he did was recite poetry, work on them. Imagine even battling some great poets or rappers like Eminem. He mentions in an interview I saw, and even in the book he comes up, but he tries to, in that way occupy himself with that. And in that darkness, his poetry is a bright light. One thing, though, I think is interesting when people hear something like that, it can feel good to us to think, well, then maybe something good came of, this was good in a way, it inspired his poetry. I saw an interview with Ian Manuel, and it wasn't exactly put that way, but you felt an element of that, see, you would have never written this poetry had you not gone through that. And I think we have to be careful about those types of conclusions or ideas, because they're generally coming from our desire just to make things seem fair or right or good. It's like, maybe it was good this happened. Well, no, it was a complete injustice for a boy who did something at 13 and then to be in solitary confinement for 18 years. Yes, maybe something good came from that, or he made something good out of something so dark. But would any of us want to go be put in solitary confinement for the next 18 years to see what we come up with? I think no one would say yes to that. So we have to be aware of not just seeking the feeling that we want of, okay, things are fair or just in the world, or things make sense, or this was good too, in a way. It was in no way something acceptable or good. I think it's incredible and inspiring what he was able to create through that, or to keep his sanity through all of this. But we don't want to conflate the two and think, well, somehow that makes it good or justified. But throughout the book, as I mentioned, he also expresses and shares different legal battles he had appealing his decisions. Even the way he was sentenced, it was not clear what was going to be sentenced, and he was given, again, life without parole when he was just 14, still a teenager. At some point, the Equal Justice Initiative, Brian Stevenson, I think, is the head of that organization. They got involved in his case, and that was very important to help him get some free and really high-quality legal assistance that eventually led to his release. And he explains, and there's so many different layers to that, including some Supreme Court cases that ended up affecting his case in different ways of juveniles being sentenced at a certain age to certain punishments that were deemed then unconstitutional or not okay, that violated certain statutes, and so eventually he was released. As I mentioned, the woman that he shot, Debbie Bakery, it's pretty incredible. He, in looking through some of his court records while he was in jail early on, he saw that her address and phone number were on one of them, and he actually calls her, not knowing what it's going to be like. And he shares some of what they talk about, and she asks him, "Why did you shoot me?" And he does share his, he didn't want to, and obviously what he was going through. And they have this communication here and there, writing letters at some points. Then for some periods of time they no longer are in contact, but they get in contact, and a few times Debbie shows up to his court hearings, and she does express that she forgives him, and essentially does not want him to be in prison anymore. And it really wasn't that she, I saw some interviews that made it seem that it was her forgiving him that made him get released, but it doesn't at all. From what I saw in the book or understood his descriptions of things, that wasn't really the case. It might have had some small impact, but really it was these other legal issues that came about that allowed for him to eventually get his freedom. But still, it's an interesting and very, I think, inspiring aspect of the story of how he shot her in the face, literally, and then they have created a relationship, and you can see videos and images of them now hugging after he was released. And so it's I think a wonderful story of redemption, of rehabilitation, of inspiration, of forgiveness, what they have created. And so I've seen some images of them hugging, and it's quite remarkable to see that. And maybe for us to keep in mind, most of us, if we're upset with anyone or holding on to a grudge, it's for something, hundreds of times less, thousands of times less. You can't even compare it to something like this. And it could be a reminder that maybe we can have more room for forgiveness as well. But I might talk some more on these issues after the break. But before we go to the commercial break, I wanted to, as I said, share a poem that the title of the book, My Time Will Come, by Ian Manuel, is inspired by this poem he wrote while he was in prison, which is called My Time Gonna Come. So this is Ian Manuel, My Time Gonna Come.
I promise you, the brunt of my oppression has a purpose, and the same person that you persecute will one day be worshipped. Though I stand before you bare-chested and shirtless, with my soul and emotions naked, just wanting to be nurtured. Yeah, despite the desperation, desertion, and hurting, my time gonna come. Though I composed this poem not knowing if I'll ever be able to perform it in an auditorium, I do it with the faith of a poet that believes he was born to do it, like an acorn caught up in a storm, flung from the branch where it was born. You can only hold me back for so long. My time gonna come. Despite the difficulties and disappointments, my determination remains undaunted. Though the waters of my tomorrows are deep and uncharted, the buoyance of my character will float unwavering towards them, like a song written yet unrecorded. My time gonna come. Though you wrapped me in chains and sprayed me with chemical flames and did all of the things you did to add to my pain, my circumstances will change. I believe this with the depths of my being, that as long as this world continues to spin, it cannot end until it's been enjoyed by Ian. Remember this day, because things won't always be this way. My time gonna come. My time gonna come against all conceivable odds. My time will come.
Welcome back. So to start the show, talked about the book My Time Will Come by Ian Manuel. And as I mentioned, it's a heartbreaking but also inspiring story of what he endured in his life and overcame. But of course, what he has overcome is not just about him, it's about others who are also suffering. And so I wanted to talk a bit about the prison system we have in the United States. And really, I know it's one of those things where it's easy to say we have too many people in prison, which is definitely true. But I wanted to look at some other aspects of it as well. So I checked some statistics. I think it's 2.3 million people as of 2016 are in prison in the United States. And that's a lot. It's a little under 1%. It might even be more than 1% of the adult population. So to me, that's just unacceptable. But it also begs the question, what are we trying to achieve with this? And so I'm not a legal scholar, but I'll share some thoughts on my ideas of this as well, of what are we trying to accomplish by having even prisons or jails. At times there is a need to remove certain people from the population, but I think that's much smaller than the number we see in the United States, way less than that. And even with that, we have to be mindful of making that determination. As I said with Manuel, at the age of 13, he did something, and he was deemed irredeemable, that his life could not really have value, or that he needed to be removed from society forever. So there are a few different reasons why we punish or have things like jail to begin with. One is removing individuals from society. There's also a sense that there has to be just deserts, or a punishment that fits a crime. It doesn't feel good if someone does something wrong and there's no punishment for that. It gives a sense of justice and balance when we have that happen. There's also rehabilitation, which I think we see almost none of in our current system. And actually, at one point, Manuel, he mentions this part from a judge that says that the role of punishment at the time when his sentence was made, or during this time period, was punishment, not rehabilitation. That was the function or the focus of the sentencing and what was going on. And so we don't see that aspect very much. And we should ask ourselves, well, why do we have the system that we have, where people get punished in the ways that they do? I think to begin with, there's one element of kind of a psychological type of a thing that plays a part, which is at times we think that we can find something bad and just get rid of it, exterminate it, terminate it, and then that's going to lead to some kind of peace or calm or goodness. If we look at even the United States, a lot of the times, and a lot of countries have this mindset on, I guess it's not diplomacy, but in the ways of trying to create peace. Well, if you kill all the bad people, if you kill all your enemies, then you're going to have peace. Then everything is good. So all you have to do is find all the bad people and kill them and get rid of them, and then you have peace. And we see that that's not at all the reality of the world, and it doesn't work. You can't kill yourself to peace. You can't just war yourself to peace. Peace involves having good relationships, having good, respectful relationships between different people, countries, or whatever the dynamics at play are. It doesn't happen by killing everyone you don't like or who disagrees with you. And I think partially we see that with how we deal with the prison and punishment in the United States, that there's these bad people and we have to just put them away forever. But what does it mean, bad people? And really, to me, it's a reflection of the fact that we all have good and bad aspects and elements to us, and we do that individually as well. I have to just kill the bad parts of me, or get rid of the bad parts of me, and then I'll be okay. I'll be happy, I'll be healthy, I'll be strong, or whatever it is that we're looking at, rather than recognizing that it could be that all of them are parts of us. We all have these elements, and it's about how to deal and manage them, rather than somehow we can exterminate them or get rid of them. Even clients at times will have these types of goals, or maybe they'll bring this as a concept of what they want to do in therapy, is to get rid of this part of themselves. And usually it's, I let them know that probably won't be happening, and it might not even be healthy, because there's probably elements to that aspect of yourself that we can learn from, and that actually you need, or can be beneficial in certain ways. They won't completely ever go away, but maybe we don't want them to. And I think the same is true of people in our population. Again, there could be a very select, small few of people with antisocial personality that's very strong, who might be violent and have no remorse, and even I would still hope we can try treatment for someone like that, but there is some people that probably would be harmful, unfortunately, no matter what. I can accept that. But like I said, the proportions we're seeing in a country like the United States, it's definitely not what we are seeing. So I think that's one aspect of it, this mindset that we can just get rid of bad things and that's it, and it's going to make everything go away. Even it's how we look at the health mindset. Last week with Dr. Scott Rauer explaining things about gut and digestive health, and in some ways the Western mentality of health came up. Okay, just kill the unhealthy things and then you'll be healthy. And I know with cancer sometimes it can get to that point, so I understand those treatments might include that, but it's how we deal with almost anything. Okay, I have a issue with this part of my liver. Well, can we just get rid of that part of it and do this, or just take a pill and erase it with the damage, rather than recognizing that it's a whole system and you need to make everything function well, rather than just kill the parts you don't like. And so I think we have that mindset in how we deal with ourselves physically, as I just talked about, health-wise, psychologically, and how we think we're going to deal with things or even feelings. Oh, if I can just get rid of my sad feelings, I'll be okay. If I can just get making my anxiety disappear, I'll be okay. But really, it's about integrating and incorporating all of that. And I think the human body and the human population, we can make a type of parallel that the same thing is going on there. And similarly, actually taking this one step further, oftentimes when we see individuals, and Manuel is a clear example of that, when they're in a society that's not functioning well and not functioning well for everyone, well, then you're going to have these types of unhealthy things come about. So if you have children and individuals who are being raised in extreme poverty, impoverished from a physical standpoint, nutritional standpoint, psychological standpoint, not just neglected but also abused. Ian Manuel shares his own abuse in various ways, including sexual abuse from his older brother. When you have individuals in these circumstances, it's going to lead to things like more crime and violence. That's a very clear causal agent. If you have high levels of poverty, it's going to increase crime and violence. If you reduce the poverty, you reduce that violence. So rather than just thinking, well, these are bad people and we have to get rid of them, we should be looking at the system. Why are there children like Ian Manuel who at 10, 11 are on the streets and trying to steal or rob or do little things to make some money? Why do we have a system that's like that? And here again, the need for a just world explanations come in, and people will tell themselves, if I was living in some type of extreme poverty or this kind of environment, I would just persevere and I would work hard and study hard and make my way out of that no matter what. It doesn't matter where you put me. And I can't say you definitely would not, but for you to tell yourself that you definitely would, you're also fooling yourself and lying to yourself to think you know what it's like to actually be in that situation. Or I've heard people even say, oh, if I was in prison, I would just do everything right so I get good behavior and I get out so quickly because it's so easy. It's like, well, do you actually know what it's like to be in prison? I can't say I do. I visited and I could tell that I did not want to be there, and I also still would not know what it's like just by visiting to actually to serve a sentence there. But people can think that it's easy to know what they would do in a different situation, and here's where I try to encourage people, including myself, to have the humility that you don't know what you would do in a different situation, because you don't know what it actually feels like. Because when you think about what you do in a situation, you think about it without the feelings, which is quite interesting to me. I've noticed that when we try to think, oh, if I did that, I would do this. But it's because you don't know what you would actually feel like in that situation. You're just thinking actually what would feel good to do or what you would want to do. Just like if you think, oh, if I was even freezing to death, it was so cold, I think I would just be okay. It's just cold. But you don't really know what it feels like when you're that cold and what it makes you do or what it makes you want to do. So similarly, it's easy to think, well, that's no excuse. And another thing that people use to bolster, or they think bolster this argument is, well, look at this one person that made it out. So, see, you can make it. And the question isn't, can you make it out of a really dark situation? It's, is it fair for it to be so hard for some people to make it out? Is it just? Is there justice that some children are born into a situation that is so much harder to get out of than others? It's not an issue of can. Okay, let's go for a race and the winner gets $1 million. You have to run 100 miles. I have to run 1 mile. It's possible. You can beat me if you were so much faster and maybe I get injured or something happens, but that definitely doesn't mean it's fair. And so we have to let go of our feeling, that good feeling and comfort that comes, okay, the world is just fair, everything is okay. It's always uncomfortable to recognize there could be something unfair and unjust because we have to do something about it, which we don't want to do. And we also want to believe that we are where we are just because of our goodness, our hard work, and all of those things, when it's always going to be much more complicated than that. Doesn't mean you haven't worked hard to get to where you are, but it also doesn't mean that's the only reason you are where you are. There are so many other factors that affect that. But so coming back to our system, when we see that kids are violent, rather than blaming them as bad kids and irredeemable, we should look at why is society allowing for kids to become this way. And we really have to take a step back. And so when we punish just to punish, and really to me, when we say the corrections system or the rehabilitation system of prison, it's none of those things. It is, as that judge said, it's about punishment and punishment only, and making us feel good about it, that we're punishing these people because they are bad. And another group that gets dehumanized in a very significant way is inmates and people who have been convicted of crimes, even once they're released. In Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, she outlines this very well, about how individuals, even when they're released, first of all, the prison system itself and how many people are in prison, she outlines well how this is unfair and has a lot of racial bias in there. But then once people are released, they're treated as second-class citizens for the rest of their lives. It's like a caste system, that they're never really full citizens again. And so it's very easy for us to think, oh, see, but they're bad people, they deserve this. But we have to also tease apart another part of the psychology of punishment, which is there can be a crime that is something wrong or someone takes a wrong action, but it doesn't mean any punishment is okay. And that's sometimes what people conflate. They'll say, well, the person did something wrong. This also comes up with issues with the police. If someone is shot, well, they didn't listen, so they got shot. So not listening to the police officer is enough of a crime to be killed? That's should be execution. They should get the death penalty for, let's say, not complying or doing something. That's what we have to also look at, is not just, is there something wrong being done? Is the punishment fitting the crime? And very often we just say, well, if they did something wrong, I don't really care what happened to them. But that's a big part of the justice system, is not just what's right or wrong, it's what's the punishment. Imagine you went 5 miles over the speed limit and then you got life in jail. We wouldn't say, well, you went too fast. That was not right. You should have went slower. So I guess that's it for you. We would say that's not right, even if we agree that what you were doing was not safe. Maybe 5 miles is, I don't know if you can get pulled over for that, but nonetheless, maybe it made the point. So we have to be aware of when we're punishing, well, what does that do? And another thing that it's doing is that we are just punishing individuals and we're actually making them worse. We're not correcting people when we send them to prisons the way that they are. And Manuel outlines his horrific experience in jail from, in his poem, you hear him talking about gassing and how they would do some kind of chemical agents, I don't know exactly what it was, and spray them. And he talked about how it burned on his body. And he even says in a few interviews, if you saw what they did to George Floyd in public, in broad daylight, and it got recorded, imagine what they do to people in jail when there are no cameras And I think that I wouldn't expect anything less or more, or however you want to put it, than that. I'm not surprised. But again, it's because we dehumanize them and we create a system that dehumanizes individuals, and the whole system itself is going to, of course, reinforce that mindset. But when we put someone in those positions, what do you think happens when they are going to come out? How does that benefit them, and how does that benefit society? So some people we just remove forever. That has its own negative issues, and I think oftentimes those punishments definitely don't fit the crime. But then once they come out, I saw a kind of like a meme or a post recently that I thought was very powerful. It was talking about how for many of us, I can definitely say myself included, this last year plus of the pandemic, where we were very limited socially, especially when it came to in-person interactions, very limited, that when we started to see each other now, and now I've had a few interactions with smaller groups or seeing some individuals, I felt a little bit off, actually, when it came to socializing. Especially the first few times, it felt a little bit weird. I hadn't, wasn't accustomed to that again, and what it's like, and how the whole thing is going to go, and maybe feeling more anxious or more excited or yearning for it so much. And this post didn't get into all that detail because I saw something very brief, but it was saying we joke about this, about how we feel off socially. Imagine if you've been in jail for like 15 years, where you've been deprived in so many ways and in such a worse environment, and now we say, okay, welcome back to the real world, the outside world, and just you should be fine here. And you also get these other disadvantages that come about in our legal system of being on probation or other things that you might be facing, and then not being able to apply for jobs as easily if you've convicted a felony, getting housing, all sorts of other things, but just even from a social aspect. And so for me, that was a great point that was being made of just what we've experienced, definitely not being imprisoned, but being limited in what we were able to do, and then getting back out there and how challenging that was. So to me, the system we have that's focused just on punishment does not serve the people who are being punished well, but even the larger society well. And so I think we have to look at how much we're balancing this need to punish, or this feeling of punishing, bringing about justice, and the justice that comes about, first of all, treating all members of the human family as human, but also treating them with dignity so that when they're re-released in society, how is that going to benefit all of us as well? If they are more in a position to contribute and to live a healthier, better life. I don't think that's at all the system that we currently have, and it definitely involves rethinking, and of course changing something that big is huge, and it's not something that will happen quickly or overnight. It has political implications, a lot of financial implications. I won't get into the prison industrial complex. It's a whole business now, private prisons, and they make so much money, but they need people in them in order to keep making that money. So it sadly is a system where they need products, and the product for them is the people who get in prison. So of course they don't want sentencing and things to become lighter for that reason. But there's a lot of factors at play, but I hope it's one you'll keep in mind and recognize that just because it's called a justice system doesn't mean it's just, and doesn't mean it can't be improved. I'll leave it at that for there, but definitely a topic that will come up in future shows as well. Inspired by reading the book Ian Manuel, My Time Will Come. Let's go to a commercial break. We'll be right back.